Mold itself literally isn't toxic in the way, say, a poisonous chemical is. What is true is that some molds, under certain conditions, can produce harmful substances. In other words, it's not that mold is made of poison, it's that some molds can make poison. And because as a regular person, you never really know what you're dealing with, it becomes a lot easier to just say all mold is bad. And that's sort of the general message that we all get for the general safety of the population. So these poisons that molds produce are what scientists call mycotoxins. If mycotoxins get into your body, say you inhale mold spores carrying them, or you ingest them in the form of moldy food, and sometimes you can even get this through skin contact in some cases if you wear a dress that has had mold and you have an open wound, then they can cause a variety of health problems. And some mycotoxins are potent enough to cause very serious illness at high exposure. Now, it's important to set the record straight that not all mold is toxic, but all forms of mold signal an indoor air quality problem. Whether it's the notorious black mold or just common mildew, any significant mold growth indoors is a red flag. And the reason for that is because mold only grows unchecked if there is excess moisture in a space. So this could be from a leaky pipe or water seeping into a basement or poor ventilation that causes condensation. And mold in your home means there are spores and fragments flying around in the air that you breathe. And because we don't know the type of mold, these spores that are flying around could be potentially the dangerous types of spores. And even if these known dangerous spores are from molds that don't make lethal toxins, they can still trigger things like allergies and irritate your respiratory system and generally just degrade the quality of your home. But how did we even know that mold was a problem? The first reported case of mold began in Prague. A Czech mycologist was studying mold and noticed a particular greenish, darkish mold that was growing on the wallpaper of a home that he was studying. Now, this was 1837, so nobody was freaking out about toxic mold. It was just an interesting new fungus that this bored scientists cataloged. Now, fast forward to the 1920s when farms in Russia and Ukraine report a strange illness on the farm animals, especially the horses. These animals were eating hay and straw that had gotten moldy, and the animals fell horribly ill. They developed sores in their mouths and their noses bled, and they had trouble standing, and many of them died. And this phenomenon was often seen during wet conditions. And that's because mold had grown on the hay that these horses ate, and it produced these potent mycotoxins. And the mycotoxins were punishing the horses. They even found out that farm workers handling the moldy straw had skin rashes and sickness as well. After that, there were other reports of turkeys dying after eating turkey feed. But the major thing that thrust mold into the spotlight was when in Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1990s, it became reported that children had died of toxic mold exposure. Over the span of about a year, a cluster of infants in low income neighborhoods developed very scary health problems. They had acute pulmonary hemorrhage, which was basically just severe bleeding in their lungs, and several of these babies died. And so, health investigators found that many of the homes that these families lived in had major water damage and were infested with mold. However, this case turned out to be a little more complicated because other researchers who looked at the data later on pinpointed out flaws in the way that the research was investigated, and the CDC eventually even withdrew the conclusions that these kids had died of mold. But the news had already made its rounds, and people had already come to terms with the term of toxic mold. And so people started paying a lot more attention to mold in their houses. And finally, in the early 2000s, there was an explosion of mold inspections and mold related lawsuits, and the media reported on this, and this eventually launched the toxic mold era. So how do you know you've been exposed to mold? Well, there are actually a few symptoms that are associated with mold exposure, and this range from milder things like allergic reactions, right? So think things like sneezing, having a runny nose, or having itchy, watery eyes, or even just skin irritation. Many molds have spores or fragments that act as allergens, which means that your immune system sees them sometimes and it overreacts. So if you've ever walked into a damp, moldy basement and suddenly your nose starts running and you get a tickle down your throat, it's more likely you're having an allergic response. If you also start sneezing and coughing and have any sort of nasal congestion, then that may be a sign that you've been exposed to mold. Mold is also a big trigger for patients who have asthma and other respiratory conditions like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD. There's a condition that a lot of patients with this disease suffer from, which is known as hypersensitivity pneumonitis, which is essentially a reaction in the lungs that happens to some people who breathe in certain types of moldy environments. But the more controversial frontier that scientists are beginning to bring forward is the impact that mold has on neurological and cognitive systems. And the reason why scientists are bringing this up is because they have noticed that people living with mold problems have reported a lot of neurological symptoms. So things like a persistent headache or difficulty concentrating or feeling mentally foggy, which people sometimes refer to as brain fog, and even other things like dizziness or memory loss. There are also examples of patients that experience depressive episodes like fatigue and anxiety. But how can mold cause this? And the one theory they're hinging on is that some of the mycotoxins that mold releases can affect the nervous system. However, it's important to state that the link between mold and the neurological effects is not yet fully proven. Researchers are still doing a lot of ongoing research, but it's very challenging because these symptoms can be caused by so many different things that are often self-reported, and you cannot go around inspecting everybody's home. But smaller studies have shown correlations, for example, with noticing that cognitive function improves after a patient is removed from a certain environment. But this is not unanimously agreed within the medical community. A term that you may come across a lot when you're talking about this is something known as CIRS, or chronic inflammatory response syndrome. This concept was popularized by some physicians who noticed that they had certain patients that just had long-term unexplained illnesses. And so they theorized that this could be as a result of exposure to biotoxins, specifically mold mycotoxins, or even toxins from algae or other tick-borne diseases. And so when we're dealing with CIRS, the idea is that the patient already has a susceptible immune system. And then this immune system goes haywire after a significant mold exposure, and then that person never fully resets. Such a person may experience a wide range of symptoms across multiple systems. So this will range from fatigue to muscle aches to joint pain to headaches to cognitive issues to problems with breathing to problems with numbness and tingling. They just have so many problems. They just have a whole grab bag of problems that cannot be explained and that persist on and on. Now, it is crucial to know that CIRS is still very controversial. It's not yet an officially recognized medical diagnosis in many mainstream circles. There are doctors and researchers who are devoting a lot of time and resources to developing diagnostic criteria or treatment protocols on how to deal with this disease. And there are also many patients who firmly believe that mold has made them chronically ill. But at the same time, other experts are arguing that CIRS isn't well defined and that more rigorous research is needed. So if you ever mention that you suspect that you may have CIRS, do it as a theoretical framework that's being studied rather than a universally accepted condition, because it will go on to show how serious mold-related issues can get. And even though mold has been around forever, scientific research into mold and health is still very much active and ongoing today. In fact, as technology improves, the awareness grows and we're discovering new things about how mold and its toxins interact with our bodies and how to better detect and manage mold problems. For example, we understand the mechanism of action of what mold toxins do to us.